The first sign that my audition had turned into something deeply, deeply unhinged wasn't the flowers. It wasn't the private car that started appearing outside my apartment building before I'd even signed a contract. It wasn't even the argument I overheard through a closed office door about which sister was allowed to walk me to rehearsal. It was the two identical folders sitting on my dressing room table on a Tuesday morning, each one embossed with a different family crest, each one containing an exclusive 5-year, 7-figure performance contract, and each one requiring me to choose, in writing, by end of day, which Thorn sister I belonged to. I want to be clear, I had been employed by this circus for exactly 19 days. I stood there in a leotard that still smelled like new fabric, holding 2 contracts worth more money than my entire family had made in a decade, and I did the only reasonable thing a person in that situation can do. I said no to both of them. I told them, as calmly as I could manage while my hands were visibly shaking, that I hadn't come here to be owned by anyone, least of all 2 women who apparently thought jealousy was a legitimate business strategy. I told them I'd walk out that afternoon and audition somewhere else if this was what career support looked like in the Thorn family. I watched 2 of the most powerful women in the entertainment industry go completely, uncharacteristically silent. Unfortunately, that was only the beginning. Let's rewind. 3 weeks earlier, back when the biggest problem in my life was affording rent, and nobody in this story knew my name yet. If you love a story where things start ordinary and spiral into something completely ridiculous before spiraling right back into something surprisingly real, go ahead and subscribe now, because I promise you, by the end of this, you're going to have very strong opinions about which sister you were rooting for. My name's Marlo, and 3 weeks before those contracts landed on my dressing table, I was one of 400 people standing in a freezing warehouse in the middle of a Tuesday, waiting for a callback number that felt increasingly unlikely to ever get called. I'd been a circus performer, technically, for 6 years. Aerial silks mostly, some rope work, enough contortion training to make casting directors nervous and impressed in equal measure. I was good. I want to say that plainly, the way you're supposed to say true things about yourself, even when nobody around you has bothered to notice them yet. I was good, and for 6 years, almost nobody who mattered had noticed. I'd worked 3 different traveling shows that folded under bad management. I'd been the understudy who never got called, the reliable extra who filled empty slots on the bill, the girl one stage manager called Marla for 4 straight months because he genuinely could not be bothered to learn my actual name, and I was too tired, by month 3, to keep correcting him. I had, by that point, developed a very specific, very unglamorous skill. The ability to be excellent at something in a room full of people who simply did not care. So when I heard the Thorn Circus Dynasty was holding open auditions for their flagship show, I almost didn't go. The Thorns weren't just circus people. They were a full entertainment empire, old money turned modern conglomerate, 3 sisters running 3 different corners of an industry that most people in my position could only dream of touching. Odessa Thorn ran the circus itself, the crown jewel of the family business, famously exacting, famously impossible to impress. Her 2 younger sisters ran their own divisions entirely, Calla Thorn, cool and immaculate, at the head of the family's luxury talent and modeling house, and Remy Thorn, loud and unpredictable, running a media division that had turned 3 separate unknown performers into overnight viral sensations in the last 2 years alone. I went anyway. 400 people, 1 open slot on the flagship bill, and a bag lunch I ate standing up because sitting down felt like giving up. I made it to the final round on the strength of 11 minutes on a silk rig that I performed for an audience of exactly 1 woman, sitting alone in the dark of an empty auditorium, arms crossed, expression giving away absolutely nothing. I remember exactly what that 11 minutes felt like, because it was the first time in years I'd let myself perform like the outcome actually mattered, instead of protecting myself in advance from another rejection. I'd gotten good, over 6 seasons of disappointment, at performing with one foot already out the door emotionally, at not letting myself want anything too badly, because wanting things and getting hurt had become such a reliable pair. That day, for reasons I still can't fully explain, I let myself want it. I climbed that rig like it was the only chance I'd ever get, because as far as I knew, it might have been. That woman was Odessa Thorne, and when I landed my dismount, breathing hard, sweat running down my spine, she didn't clap, she didn't smile, she simply said, in a voice that carried perfectly across a completely silent room, "Do that again, but slower on the release. You're rushing the moment that should matter most." I did it again, slower, and when I landed the second time, she finally stood, walked to the edge of the stage, and said the 4 words that changed the entire trajectory of my life. "You start Monday. Congratulations." I didn't know yet that congratulations was, in this family, apparently a starting gun for chaos. If you're already invested in finding out exactly how bad it got, stick around, because the next part is where 2 more Thorne sisters enter the picture, and nothing about my quiet, underpaid, overlooked circus career stayed quiet ever again. Monday morning, I showed up to the Thorne Circus Dynasty's rehearsal complex, expecting exactly what I'd expected at every other circus I'd ever worked for. A cramped changing room, a rushed introduction, maybe a company manager who'd get my name wrong within the first hour, out of sheer indifference. Instead, I got Odessa Thorne herself, standing in the middle of the main rehearsal ring at 7 in the morning, going over the season's rigging schedule with an intensity that made 3 separate riggers visibly nervous just standing near her. "You're early," she said, without looking up from her clipboard. I like knowing the space before everyone else gets here. That got her attention. She looked up, studied me for a long moment with an expression I'd later learn was, for her, roughly the equivalent of enthusiastic praise from anyone else. Good instinct. Most new hires spend their first week trying to impress the room instead of learning it. She handed me a folder without ceremony. Schedule, contract terms, a season calendar marked with dates that made my stomach flip with excitement I hadn't let myself feel in years. "You're on the main bill, starting in 3 weeks. Don't make me regret this." I didn't know yet that "don't make me regret this" was, from Odessa, dangerously close to a declaration of affection. I learned that later. What I learned first, within about 90 minutes of my first full day, was that Odessa Thorne ran her entire circus the way she apparently ran her whole life, with total, unbending competence, very little patience for excuses, and an expectation that everyone around her operate at the same relentless standard she set for herself. She noticed things. That was the part that got under my skin fastest. She noticed when I adjusted my grip 1/2 centimeter to compensate for a slightly uneven rig. She noticed when I stayed late, alone, running the same 40 seconds of choreography, over and over, until it stopped feeling like effort. She also noticed things that had nothing to do with performance. On my second day, she caught me eating lunch alone in a corner of the equipment room, the same defensive habit I'd carried from show to show for years, and instead of leaving me to it, she pulled up a crate and sat down across from me without asking permission, which for Odessa Thorne, I would later learn, was its own kind of declaration. "You eat like someone bracing for the company to disappear," she observed, unwrapping her own lunch with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything. 6 years of companies disappearing will do that to a person. Not here. She said it simply, like a fact rather than a promise. which somehow made it land harder than if she'd tried to reassure me. I don't build things that fold. Ask anyone who's worked for me longer than a week. I believed her immediately, which should probably have worried me more than it did, given how quickly everything afterwards spiraled into complete chaos. On my third day, she appeared at the edge of the ring at 9 at night, arms crossed, and said, "You don't have to prove anything to me twice. I already decided you're good. Go home." "I'm not doing this for you," I said, more honestly than I probably should have. "I'm doing it because 6 years of nobody watching taught me I only trust the work I've done when nobody's watching." Something shifted behind her eyes. Not quite warmth, but recognition. The particular look of someone realizing they'd found a person who understood a language they didn't get to speak very often. "That's the smartest thing anyone said to me in this ring in about 2 years," she said, and left before I could figure out how to respond to that. If you're the kind of viewer who already senses exactly where this is headed, you're right. And you're also only about a third of the way to understanding how complicated it was about to get. Because Odessa wasn't the sister who noticed me first in the way that ends up mattering for this story. That distinction belongs to someone else entirely, and she showed up 4 days later wearing sunglasses indoors and carrying a coffee she definitely didn't need to bring me personally. Her name was Calla Thorne, and she found me during a break between rehearsals, sitting alone on an equipment trunk, going over choreography notes on my phone. "You're the new headliner," she said, not a question, sliding onto the trunk beside me like we'd known each other for years, instead of exactly 0 minutes. "Odessa's been insufferable about you all week. I had to see what the fuss was about." "I don't think I'm the fuss. I think Odessa's just particular." Odessa is a great many things, but she has never once in her life gushed about a new hire the way she's gushed about you. Calla studied me over the rim of a coffee cup that probably cost more than my grocery budget for the week, and something in her gaze felt entirely different from her sister's, less about cataloging competence, more about actually seeing the person underneath it. You've got calluses in exactly the wrong places for someone who's clearly been well-trained. Who taught you? Nobody really. I mostly figured it out through 6 years of shows that didn't have budget for real coaching. Something flickered across her face, quick and genuine. "That's absurd. You perform like someone who's had a decade of formal training." She reached over, unhurried, and turned my hand over gently to examine a worn patch of calloused skin along my palm, and I felt that small, deliberate touch land somewhere much deeper than my hand. "I run the talent house, not the circus. I find people like you for a living, people the industry hasn't figured out how valuable they are yet. I don't think I've ever found someone this undervalued who was also this good." Is that a compliment or a business pitch? "With me, it's rarely just one thing," she said, and there was something knowing in the way she smiled that told me this conversation, however casual it seemed, was going to matter far more than a coffee break should. I didn't understand yet exactly how much it was going to matter, or that within the week an entirely different Thorne sister would be finding her own excuse to appear at my elbow with an agenda just as personal. That third sister arrived the way I'd come to learn she arrived at everything, loudly, unpredictably, and completely uninvited. Her name was Remy, and I met her because she burst into an afternoon rehearsal holding a ring light and announcing, to absolutely nobody's surprise but mine, that she was filming spontaneous content for her media division and needed someone with an actual personality to be in it. "I have rehearsal," I told her, mid-stretch, mildly alarmed by the sheer velocity of her energy. "This is better than rehearsal. This is exposure." She dropped onto the mat beside me, without asking, already scrolling through her phone. "Odessa's new headliner, right? The one she won't shut up about?" I need 30 seconds of you doing something impressive so I can build a whole campaign around discovering you before literally anyone else in this industry figures out you exist. I didn't agree to that. You will. Everyone does eventually. She grinned, entirely unbothered, and something about her chaotic, unfiltered energy was, despite every instinct telling me to be annoyed, genuinely magnetic in a way I didn't expect. Come on, one video. If people hate it, I'll personally never bother you again. If they love it, she shrugged, delighted with herself. Well, then you're stuck with me. I did the video. Mostly because it was easier than arguing with a woman who apparently didn't recognize the concept of no as a complete sentence. It got 4 million views in 11 hours. Remy showed up at my dressing room the next morning with a smoothie, an apology that wasn't really an apology, and an offer to make me internet famous by Friday that I very firmly declined. "You're no fun," she said, unbothered, dropping onto my dressing table chair like she owned it, which, given her family, she technically partially did. "Most people would kill for what I just did for you. I didn't ask you to do it. I know." Something more genuine slipped through her chaos for just a second. "That's actually why I liked doing it. Everyone who works with my family wants something from us. You didn't even want the video." She stayed longer than she needed to that morning, longer than made sense for someone who apparently ran an entire media division and had, by her own account, roughly 11 other fires to put out before lunch. She talked fast and constantly, jumping between subjects with an energy that should have been exhausting and somehow wasn't, and underneath all the chaos, I started to notice something she clearly didn't let many people see. A kind of restless loneliness, the specific isolation of someone who'd built a career out of being everyone's favorite distraction and had never quite figured out how to just sit still with one person. "You're staring at me weird," she said at one point, catching me watching her. "You're just a lot to take in first thing in the morning." "Everyone says that," she grinned, but something flickered underneath it, quick and gone. "Most people mean it as an insult, though." I didn't. That seemed to genuinely throw her, just for a second, before the chaotic momentum swept back in and she was off again, already halfway through planning her next impulsive scheme before she'd even finished her sentence about the last one. If you're keeping score, this is the moment the story stopped being about one intimidating headliner and started being about 3 thorn women, each noticing something different in me, each one about to decide, in her own particular way, that she'd found someone worth fighting for. And I promise you, the fight that followed got significantly more ridiculous than a smoothie and a ring light. Subscribe now, because the coffee wars alone are worth sticking around for. I want to walk you through exactly how fast this escalated, because it happened in stages so small, I almost didn't notice the pattern forming until it was already impossible to ignore. It started with coffee. Genuinely, embarrassingly, with coffee. Kala began having a specific order delivered to my dressing room every morning. Oat milk, 1 sugar, exactly how I'd mentioned liking it once, weeks earlier, in a conversation I hadn't realized she was cataloging. 3 days into that ritual, Remy noticed the cup sitting on my table, disappeared for 20 minutes, and returned with an entirely different order from a different shop, insisting it was objectively superior and that Kala's taste in coffee, like her taste in everything, was aggressively boring. By the end of that week, I had 2 coffees waiting for me every single morning, delivered separately by 2 different assistants from 2 different sisters who had apparently, without ever discussing it directly with each other, decided that my mornings were a competition worth having. I tried, for a while, to treat it as harmless. 2 coffees a morning is objectively a good problem to have, and I told myself as much, right up until the morning I found a 3rd cup waiting alongside the other 2, not from either sister, but from Odessa, who apparently couldn't stand watching her sisters escalate an increasingly ridiculous rivalry without at least quietly ensuring my actual preferences were represented somewhere in the chaos. Her note, tucked under the cup, simply read, "Ignore both of them. This is the correct order." I laughed out loud, in an empty dressing room, alone, for the first time since I'd started at that circus, and something about that small, dry act of quiet competence, competing without even trying to compete, told me everything I needed to know about which sister actually understood restraint. It escalated from there in ways that would have been funny if I hadn't been standing directly in the middle of it. Kala arranged, with zero warning, for a private car to collect me from rehearsal one evening, only for Remy to intercept it in the parking lot and inform the driver, with total confidence, that plans had changed and I'd be riding with her instead. I stood there, exhausted, sweaty, holding my gym bag, watching two billionaires argue about transportation logistics like it was a hostage negotiation. "I called the car first," Kala said, arms crossed, voice icy in the particular way that made grown riggers flinch. "You always call the car first. That doesn't make it your car. It is, functionally, my car. I own the car service. I own 40% of the car service, actually, since the last restructuring, so I'm going to walk," I announced, to nobody's apparent surprise, and started toward the exit on foot, while two of the most powerful women in the industry continued arguing about corporate ownership stakes in a rideshare company behind me. Neither of them let me actually walk home. Both of them, independently, showed up along my route 10 minutes later, in two separate cars, forcing me to choose between them in the middle of a sidewalk at 9 at night while I genuinely just wanted to go home and sleep. I picked neither. I called a regular rideshare on my own phone and left them both standing there. I want to be fair to both of them, though, because it wasn't only absurd. There were moments buried in all that chaos that felt real in a way I couldn't easily dismiss. The same week as the car incident, I mentioned once, in passing, exhausted and half-joking, that I missed my mother's cooking, a dish from home I hadn't had in years because none of the restaurants near any circus I'd ever worked for came close. 3 days later, without any fanfare, a container showed up at my apartment with a note in Kala's handwriting, explaining she'd tracked down a chef who specialized in exactly that regional cooking and had it made fresh. No cameras, no announcement, nothing designed to be seen by anyone but me. That kind of quiet attention was so different from the performative chaos of the car chase that I didn't know how to hold both versions of her in my head at the same time. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't, because apparently losing a round only made both of them escalate the next one. The following week, Kala had an entire private rehearsal studio built onto the back of the talent house. Soundproofed, professionally rigged, in case, she said, with total sincerity, you ever wanted somewhere quieter to train. 2 days later, Remy launched what she called Marlowe Watch, a dedicated segment on her media channel, following my rehearsals, my routines, my life, with a follower count that had climbed into the hundreds of thousands before I'd even agreed to any of it. Odessa, for her part, watched all of this unfold with the particular exhausted patience of an eldest sister who had clearly seen this exact pattern play out before, over entirely different objects of obsession, more times than she cared to count. "They'll settle down," she told me once, dry, not entirely convincing even herself. "Eventually. Is this normal for your family?" Define normal. She almost smiled. My sisters have never in their lives wanted the same thing at the same time before. I'm honestly not sure either of them knows how to lose gracefully, because neither of them has ever had to try. If you've ever been the person standing quietly in the middle of two forces of nature who've decided, independently, that you're worth fighting over, you understand exactly the exhausting, flattering, faintly terrifying position I was in. And if you think it stayed at the level of coffee and cars, you are extremely wrong, because the next thing that happened involved an entire restaurant, and I promise you, it only got more absurd from there. Stick around, because we're just getting started. The restaurant incident happened on a Thursday, and I still don't fully understand how it escalated as fast as it did. Before I get to the restaurant, I have to tell you about the emergency, because it set the whole disaster in motion. Kala had called me mid-afternoon, voice tight with urgency, insisting there was a crisis with my costume fitting that required my immediate attention at the talent house across town. I dropped everything and went, only to discover, 40 minutes later, standing in an empty fitting room with a bored tailor who clearly had no idea what emergency I was referring to, that there was no crisis at all. Kala had simply wanted an excuse to see me somewhere Remy wouldn't think to interrupt. I wasn't even angry. Not really. Not yet. Mostly I was tired. And a little bit charmed despite myself, which I think was exactly the problem. It's very hard to stay properly boundaried with someone who invents entire fake emergencies just to spend 20 unremarkable minutes with you, especially when some small, starved part of you has never had anyone care enough to bother. Kala had made a reservation, quietly, at a small, exclusive place near the rehearsal complex, intending, she told me later, to finally have one uninterrupted dinner when nobody's sister showed up uninvited. Remy found out. I still don't know how, and neither of them will admit whose staff leaked it. And instead of simply showing up to interrupt, she did something so characteristically extra that even Odessa, hearing about it afterward, put her head in her hands. She bought the restaurant, not a table, the entire building. That same afternoon, before dinner service even started, ownership had legally transferred, and Remy walked in wearing a chef's coat she had absolutely no right to wear, announcing that she'd be personally overseeing the kitchen for the evening, effectively guaranteeing that Kala's quiet, private dinner would now involve her sister hovering nearby with a spatula and an expression of total, gleeful victory. Kala, to her credit, did not scream. She simply looked at her sister for a long, cold moment and said, "You bought a restaurant." "I bought a restaurant," Remy confirmed, entirely without shame. "Because I made a reservation. Because you made a reservation and didn't invite me." I sat there between them, watching two grown, extraordinarily powerful women have what was functionally a custody dispute over dinner plans, and I remember thinking, with a kind of stunned, exhausted clarity, that apparently this was just what conflict resolution looked like when you had unlimited resources and absolutely no practice being told no. "I'm going home," I said, standing up, and for the first time since the whole thing started, both sisters actually looked a little embarrassed. "Marlo," Kala started. "I like both of you," I said, honestly, because it was true, and pretending otherwise felt like a worse kind of dishonesty than just admitting the mess I was standing in the middle of. "I don't like being a prize the two of you are competing for. There's a difference, and I need you to understand it, because I'm starting to feel less like a person you're both interested in and more like a trophy you're trying to win off each other." Neither of them had a response for that. I left the restaurant that Remy owned for exactly 6 hours before Odessa, apparently informed of the entire disaster by 3 separate panicked staff members, sold it back to its original owner the next morning with a brief, pointed note about appropriate use of company resources. I want to tell you that incident slowed things down. It didn't, not immediately, though it did mark the first time either sister seemed to genuinely register that their competition was starting to cost me something, instead of just entertaining them. What actually slowed things down was something much more serious, something I didn't fully understand until almost a month later, when I finally noticed a pattern in my own schedule that should have been obvious from the very beginning. My promotion to the flagship bill kept getting delayed. It started small enough that I almost didn't catch it. A 2-week postponement blamed on rigging inspections, then another delay blamed on costume fittings running behind, then a third delay explained away as creative adjustments to the season's opening sequence. Each individual excuse sounded reasonable. Stacked together, over 6 weeks, they added up to something that should have taken 3 weeks, taking closer to 3 months, with no end genuinely in sight. I brought it up with Odessa directly because she was the one person in this entire chaotic family who I trusted to give me a straight answer. "I don't understand," I told her, standing in her office after hours, the season calendar spread across her desk between us. "You told me 3 weeks. It's been 6, and every time I ask about the actual promotion date, someone finds a new reason to push it back." Something shifted in Odessa's expression. Not defensiveness exactly, but the particular stillness of someone realizing they'd missed something important while distracted by everything else going on around them. She pulled up the scheduling system on her computer, scrolling through approval logs with the same focused intensity she brought to everything, and went quiet for a long, uncomfortable minute. "These delays weren't approved by me," she said finally, voice tight. "Every single one has a sign-off from either Kala's office or Remy's, routed through scheduling in a way that looks procedural enough that I didn't catch it. Costume delays that were never actually costume delays. Rigging inspections that were never scheduled." She looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked genuinely, uncomfortably guilty. "I think my sisters have been quietly keeping you from advancing, Marlo. I think they've both been so focused on competing for your attention that neither of them stopped to consider what it was costing you to stay available for that competition." I felt something cold settle in my stomach, a feeling I recognized immediately because I'd spent 6 years of my career getting intimately familiar with it. The particular, humiliating sensation of realizing that being wanted and being valued were not, in fact, the same thing at all. If you've ever discovered that people who claim to admire you were quietly limiting you at the same time, you already know exactly how this next part felt, and I promise you, what I did with that discovery is the part of this story worth sticking around for. Subscribe if you haven't, because the confrontation that follows is the moment this entire story finally turns. I confronted them both together, deliberately, in Odessa's office, because I wanted witnesses, and I wanted it done exactly once, instead of relitigated separately with each sister individually. I should back up, though, and admit how long it actually took me to notice the pattern in the first place, because I think that detail matters. For most of those 6 weeks, I told myself the delays were ordinary industry friction. Every show I'd ever worked for had some. I'd trained myself, over years of disappointment, not to expect promises to hold, and that same old defense mechanism nearly kept me from noticing that this time, the broken promise wasn't random bad luck. It was a pattern, hiding in plain sight, dressed up in enough plausible paperwork that even someone as careful as me almost missed it entirely. I caught it, in the end, because of a spreadsheet. I'd started keeping my own private log of every date I was given, and every date that actually happened, an old habit from years of unreliable stage managers, and one night, cross-referencing 6 weeks of entries, I saw it laid out in a way that made my stomach drop. 3 separate excuses, 3 separate delays, and every single one traced back. When I checked the internal scheduling portal I technically had access to, as a company performer, to an approval from either Kala's office or Remy's, never once from the actual production department that should have owned that decision. I laid out the evidence Odessa had pulled, The sign-offs, the pattern, the 6 weeks that should have been 3. I watched both Kala and Remy's faces cycle through denial, then confusion, then something much harder to watch, genuine, dawning horror at what their competition had actually cost me, while they'd both been too busy trying to win to notice. "I didn't mean for it to," Kala started. "I need you to actually hear this, instead of just apologizing your way past it," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, steadier than I felt. I have spent 6 years of my career being overlooked by people who didn't think I mattered enough to notice. The two of you spent the last 6 weeks proving something almost worse, that you noticed me plenty, that you wanted me plenty, and it still didn't stop either of you from quietly costing me the one thing I actually came here for: my career, my advancement. The thing I worked 6 years for, that finally felt within reach the moment Odessa hired me, and that both of you have been unconsciously sabotaging because you were both too busy trying to keep me close. The office was completely silent. "I'm not interested in being anyone's competition prize," I continued. "I'm not interested in coffee wars or purchased restaurants or a media campaign I never agreed to. I came here to be a headliner, not somebody's trophy. If that's not something either of you can actually respect, I don't think I can keep working here, regardless of how I feel about either of you personally." Remy, for the first time since I'd met her, didn't have a joke ready. "What do you want us to do?" "I want you to stop," I said simply. "Both of you. Completely. No more manufactured proximity. No more competing for my time like it's a resource you're entitled to fight over. If either of you actually cares about me, prove it by respecting that my career isn't a bargaining chip in whatever rivalry the two of you have going, and figure out how to want something for me instead of just wanting me." I left that office not knowing what would happen next, and honestly, for the first time since I'd started at the Thorn Circus, not particularly caring whether either sister followed me out to apologize. I'd spent my whole life making myself smaller to be easy to keep around. I wasn't interested in doing it again for two women who, however much I'd started to genuinely care about them, had proven they still had a lot to learn about the difference between wanting someone and actually respecting them. Here's the part of the story I didn't see coming, and honestly, it's the part that mattered most. 2 days after that confrontation, I got a call from a rival production, an independent circus collective with a reputation for genuinely groundbreaking work, run by a producer named Vesper Okafor, who'd apparently seen the viral clip Remy posted weeks earlier and had been quietly watching my career ever since, completely unconnected to any of the chaos happening inside the Thorn family. "I'm not calling because of the drama," Vesper told me over the phone, blunt in a way I found immediately refreshing after weeks of Thorn family theatrics. "I'm calling because you're objectively one of the best aerialists I've seen work in years, and I think you deserve a company built around your actual talent instead of a company that apparently can't stop competing over you long enough to advance you properly. I'm offering you the lead, full creative input, your name on the marquee within the month, not buried in a delayed promotion schedule." I didn't answer right away. I told her I needed a few days to think, and I meant it. Not because I doubted the offer, but because for the first time in this entire chaotic saga, I wanted to make a decision about my own career without anyone else's voice in the room, including 3 sisters who'd all, in their own complicated ways, become genuinely important to me. I spent those days completely alone, deliberately unreachable, turning the offer over in my mind, without Kala's careful attentiveness, or Remy's chaotic enthusiasm, or even Odessa's steady, exacting confidence weighing in on what I should do. I thought about 6 years of being overlooked. I thought about the particular, specific relief of finally being seen, and how quickly that relief had curdled into something that limited me instead of lifting me. I thought about what it would actually mean to choose a company built around my talent instead of a family's rivalry. By the end of the third day, I knew what I was going to do, and I knew I needed to do it on my own terms, publicly, in a way that made it impossible for anyone to quietly walk it back with a counteroffer. I spent part of that third day talking it through with Vespa directly, asking practical questions instead of romantic ones, what creative control actually meant in her contracts, how her company handled advancement schedules, whether the viral attention from Remy's earlier video had created expectations I'd be walking into that I should know about ahead of time. She answered everything plainly, without flattery, the way you talk to someone you're recruiting because of their skill, rather than someone you're trying to seduce into a decision. That distinction, more than anything else, told me I was making the right call. I also spent part of that third day sitting with the harder, quieter feelings underneath the practical decision. The fact that I had, somewhere in 6 chaotic weeks, genuinely started to care about all 3 of these women, in different ways, for different reasons, and that choosing my career over staying anywhere near them meant risking losing something that had started to matter to me too. I let myself feel that loss honestly, instead of pretending the decision was purely strategic. It wasn't. It was going to cost me something real, and I wanted to walk into that final meeting knowing exactly what I was giving up, not just what I was gaining. If you've ever had to make the hardest, clearest decision of your career, while the people who claim to care about you most held their breath waiting to hear it, you already understand exactly the weight I was carrying into that final showdown. And I promise you, what happened next is the part of this story worth every single minute you've spent getting here. I called a meeting. All 3 sisters, the full company, gathered in the main rehearsal ring exactly the way Odessa had gathered everyone the day she hired me, except this time I was the one standing at the center of the room. I laid it all out, methodically, the same way I approached every routine I'd ever built. Timeline first, evidence second, conclusion last. I showed the delayed schedule. I showed the sign-offs. I showed, plainly, without embellishment, exactly how 6 weeks of competition had cost me the advancement I'd been promised, and exactly what it had taught me about the difference between being wanted and being respected. Then I told them about Vespa's offer. I've accepted it, I said, and watched something complicated move across all 3 faces at once. Odessa's controlled stillness cracking just slightly, Kala's composure faltering into something rawer, Remy, for once in her life, completely silent. Effective in 2 weeks. I'm not telling you this to punish anyone. I'm telling you because I think all 3 of you deserve to hear the truth directly instead of finding out secondhand, and because I think this company deserves a headliner who isn't quietly being held back by the people who run it. We can offer you more, Kala said quickly, and I could hear, underneath the words, real desperation. Whatever Vespa's offering, we can match it. Better terms, full creative control. Anything. You're offering me that now, I said, gently but firmly. Only after I've already walked out the door. That's exactly the problem. I don't want to stay, because you finally matched a competitor's offer under pressure. I want to know that my value was real before I had to threaten to leave to prove it. Odessa, who had said almost nothing through the entire confrontation, finally spoke, and true to form, she used far fewer words than either of her sisters, and somehow they landed harder than anything else said in that room. She's right, she said simply. We did this. Not her. Us. Remy, breaking her uncharacteristic silence, added, quieter than I'd ever heard her. I got so caught up trying to make sure you liked me best that I never once stopped to ask whether what I was doing was actually good for you. I'm sorry. That's not an excuse. It's just true. Kala, ever the most composed, took a long moment before she spoke again, and when she did, her voice had lost all its usual polish. I think I convinced myself that finding you, keeping you close, was the same thing as caring about you properly. I'm only now understanding those aren't the same thing at all. I want to tell you that moment felt like triumph. It mostly just felt like relief. The particular, hard-won relief of finally being heard by people who mattered, even if it had taken losing me, or nearly losing me, to get them there. I'm still leaving, I said, because I needed them to understand the decision wasn't up for negotiation, however genuine the apologies were. This isn't about punishing any of you. It's about me finally choosing what's actually good for my own career, instead of what keeps 3 powerful women entertained. I watched something settle over all 3 of them in that moment, different for each. Odessa's jaw tightening in the particular way she carried disappointment in herself. Kala's eyes going bright and careful in the way people manage when they refuse to let themselves actually cry in front of a room full of employees. Remy, for once, completely still, none of her usual restless energy anywhere in her body. For what it's worth, Odessa said quietly, I think Vespa's lucky to have you. I should have said that before any of this happened, instead of assuming you already knew. I did know, I said, honestly. I think that's actually part of why this hurt as much as it did. I knew my own value. I just needed the people around me to actually act like they knew it too, instead of treating that value like something to fight over. There was a long silence, and then, breaking the tension in exactly the chaotic way I should have expected, Remy asked, So does this mean we're not allowed to date you after you leave, or— Remy, Odessa said, exhausted. What? It's a fair question. I actually laughed, for the first time in weeks, and something about that small, absurd moment of comedy, after everything heavy that had just happened, felt like exactly the right way to close that particular chapter. There was one more thing I said before I left that office, something I hadn't planned to say, but that felt important once the words were already forming. For what it's worth, I don't think any of you did this because you're bad people. I think all 3 of you grew up in a family where love and possession got tangled together so early that none of you ever really learned the difference. That's not an excuse. But I don't want you to walk away from this thinking I hate you, because I don't. I just needed you to actually see me clearly, instead of seeing whatever version of me fit whatever you each needed me to be. Odessa nodded slowly, like she was filing that observation away somewhere she intended to actually revisit. That's fair, she said quietly. More than fair. 2 weeks later, I started with Vespa's company as the announced headliner. My name actually on the marquee this time. Full creative control over my own routines, for the first time in 6 years of a career that had spent most of that time making me feel invisible. The reviews called me a discovery. I knew better. I'd been good for years. I'd just finally landed somewhere that noticed without needing to compete for the privilege of noticing. Here's what I didn't expect, though, and it's the part of this story I think about most. All 3 Thorne sisters showed up to opening night, separately, without competing over seating, without buying out the theater, without a single manufactured emergency between them. They sat 3 rows apart, watching, and after the show, each of them found me individually, on their own terms, with something they'd clearly worked hard to figure out how to offer me without an agenda attached. Odessa handed me a single card with her personal number on it, no company letterhead, no contract attached. No pressure, she said, just, if you ever want to talk, about anything, not business. Kala brought a small, thoughtful gift, nothing extravagant, something she'd clearly chosen because she remembered a specific, offhand thing I'd mentioned once, weeks earlier, about missing home. I'm not trying to compete with anyone for your attention anymore, she said. I just wanted you to know I was listening, even when it didn't look like it. Remy, characteristically, showed up last, hands in her pockets, uncharacteristically nervous. I made you an actual offer this time, she said, holding out a folded piece of paper instead of her usual dramatic gesture. One date, my terms, if you want them, or yours, if you'd rather set them yourself. No cameras, no competition, just, if you're interested, eventually, whenever that makes sense for you. I looked at all three of them, standing there separately, having finally learned the difference between wanting someone and respecting them enough to let that wanting take a back seat to what that person actually needed. Ask me again in a month, I told all three of them, honestly. Let me get settled somewhere that finally sees my work for what it is first. Then we'll talk. They all agreed, immediately, without argument, which told me more about how much they'd actually changed than almost anything else that entire evening could have. A month later, established in a company that valued me on my own terms, 3 separate, careful, appropriately paced dates found their way onto a personal calendar I now kept entirely separate from my professional one, a small, deliberate symbol of a lesson that took me an entire career and one deeply chaotic circus family to finally learn. Being wanted was never the same thing as being valued. I know that now, the way you only really know something once it's cost you enough to learn it properly. And somewhere in an industry that spent 6 years overlooking me, and one family that spent 6 weeks nearly loving me into invisibility all over again, I finally found exactly what I'd been training my whole career to deserve: a spotlight that was mine, and people who finally understood that loving me meant giving that spotlight room to actually shine. I think about the version of myself who stood in that freezing warehouse 3 months earlier, eating a bag lunch, standing up, because sitting down felt like giving up, and I don't think she'd believe where this all ended up. Not the fame, though that part is genuinely strange to get used to. The other part, the part where 3 of the most powerful women in an entire industry eventually learned to want good things for me, instead of just wanting me, and where I learned that letting myself be wanted at all didn't have to mean disappearing into someone else's competition to keep it. If this story kept you hooked the way it kept me living through it, tell me in the comments which sister you were rooting for, because I promise you, that debate isn't nearly settled yet. And subscribe for the next one, because trust me, 3 powerful, chaotic women learning to share isn't nearly as dramatic as what happens next.